A lot of people consider themselves allies, but don't actually know how to show up in ways that aren't performative. My name is Maybe Burke, and you're watching Makeup for Lost Time. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there are actually tiers to what we think of as allyship. There's different levels, and there's a spectrum of what allyship could look like. And different people have different skill sets and different availability and resources available to them. So this work is going to look different on different people, and that's okay. So I want to go over with you what I consider to be the differences between an ally, an advocate, an activist, and an accomplice. And then we can explore what it looks like to leave your comfort zone and to try something new. If you don't know me, my name is Maybe Burke. I've been teaching this stuff for over a decade at this point. I do a lot of identity-based education. I teach a lot of gender-affirming practices. I specifically approach a lot of these conversations through the lens of trans and non-binary communities because those are the communities that I represent. Well, those are two communities that I do represent a lot of communities, and I consider myself an ally and an accomplice to a lot of different communities as well. And not just as a white person, I consider myself an accomplice to people of color, but also within LGBTQ communities. Like, I consider myself an accomplice to trans men and trans masculine people who don't have my shared experience. And my relationship to a lot of my identities has actually shifted and grown as I've taught about these topics, but we're not here to talk about me. At least not today, but if you want to ask questions, I'm happy to answer them in the future. I also know that the framework I teach this on doesn't necessarily work for everybody, but I think it's a good way to start thinking about these things, and it's a good starting place even if you don't fully agree with my tiers. And you might notice I mentioned 4 different words, but I have 3 different tiers. So ally is tier 1 in my mind. Advocate and accomplice are together on tier 2, and we'll talk about how they're kind of sisters. And accomplice becomes tier 3 for me. Now, I don't think that these tiers are necessarily like tiers of like who becomes the best person. It's not like a competition. It's not like ranked on like how good you are or how effective your work even is. How I rank these tiers is mostly based on what you're risking by being part of the conversation. Basically, showing up as an ally is the lowest risk with the least sacrifice, and being an accomplice comes with the most sacrifice and is the most risky. But let's make sure we understand each tier. So allyship is tier 1, and that's basically just a person who is aligned with another. A lot of us learned about allies in like world history, talking about like world wars. They were like allied countries. But when we're thinking about allies in this context, we're thinking of somebody who is supporting a community that they don't represent. So I mentioned myself as a white person supporting indigenous communities and black communities and different communities of color. And it can also be cisgender people who support trans and non-binary communities, thin people who support fat liberation, neurotypical people supporting neurodivergent people. There's so many versions of what an ally can look like. But a common conversation that has happened across different communities is the idea that you can't necessarily call yourself an ally. It has to be something that is like given to you by somebody who belongs to the community you're an ally to. It's one thing for a cisgender person to just be like, I'm an ally to trans people. It's another thing for a trans person to be like, that person actually has really shown up for us. That person is an ally. And I do tend to agree with this mentality. I definitely think there are people who call themselves allies who aren't actually doing much to show their work and show up. There are people who want the kind of credit for being an ally or want to be on the right side of history, but they might not actually even know what they can do to show up and show their support. And that's why ally ends up on tier 1, because it is just an entry point. And honestly, a lot of people are kind of skeptical and critical of allies because there's really not a test to like prove it, nor should that necessarily be like the goal or the focus. But now as we get to tier 2, hopefully you'll notice and understand the shift in responsibility, the shift in risk and sacrifice. For some people, being an ally means putting up a flag, or, like not kicking their child out of the house. Like, sometimes it is just basic acceptance and not necessarily support. What support looks like is advocating for people. And advocacy itself can happen on the individual and small group level, and obviously in much larger scale. There is advocacy that goes along with activism on the national level and the state level. And that's where we have like protests and things that call attention to people's rights, advocating for what a community is needing. But also on the individual and small group level, it means advocating for what that child needs in order to survive. It means advocating on behalf of your coworker who's being mistreated at work. Advocacy means advocating, showing support for a cause or a group. And a lot of what we see here on social media is advocacy, people who are raising awareness about issues and communities. A lot of what I do is considered advocacy. I identify as an advocate above a lot of these different terms because I am using my platforms, I am using my publicity for communities that I do represent and communities that I don't represent. And that's the fun part about advocacy. It can be advocacy on your own behalf or like within communities you are a part of, and it can be beyond community. And here you'll see where a little bit more risk and sacrifice shows up. If we're talking about speaking up for an individual's concerns, we're risking our relationship with the people that we're speaking to. We are kind of transferring that social load from the person who is being impacted onto us. We're taking on that burden, usually because we are less likely to be impacted by it. Cisgender people are more likely to be taken seriously and less likely to get blowback for supporting trans rights. White people are more likely to get through to other white people talking about race. That's why allyship and advocacy are so important, because they are really effective. As much as I educate and talk about identity, I know that a lot of what I'm doing is giving cisgender people the tools that they need to go have these conversations for me and like on our behalf. Now, I put advocacy and activism kind of on the same tier because I do think of them as like two sides of the same coin. But I'm also going to name, I am not an activist. I am a person who supports the work of activists quite often. Advocacy and spreading information are really where I shine. Activism tends to have the most burnout because activism often requires demonstrations and direct action. It often requires organizing those things and putting them together and like skill sets that I don't have. Advocacy and activism tend to go hand in hand because they have the same messaging, but different approaches to spreading that message. Where advocacy might look like informing communities and having conversations on social media or in your mailing list, or just individual conversations of making sure people are aware of what laws are being passed and how these are impacting communities. I like to think of the difference here as advocacy is about informing people who want to do right, and activism is about yelling at the people who are doing it wrong. Maybe I shouldn't say yelling, because that phrases it in a certain way. But if advocacy is the spread of information to people who are similar-minded and trying to be involved, activism is the action of going out in the streets and making demonstrations so that we interrupt the people who are actively fighting against us. That's not like a perfect distinction between the two, and a lot of people do use them interchangeably, but I know for me, because of where my skill sets lie, and because burnout is really, really heavy for me when I'm involved in activism, I try to keep a distinction between the two. And this is not to say that I never support or show up to protests and things in terms of activism. It's just not necessarily where my comfort zone lies. My comfort zone is much more grounded in being an advocate than being an activist. And that's what this framework is really for. It's for determining what your comfort zone is and where your growth zone lies. If your comfort zone is in allyship and taking any other steps and putting yourself in greater sacrifice is a daunting idea for you, that becomes your growth zone, something that you can work on implementing more of. I try to save a lot of my energy for my advocacy. And also, I push myself to show up in other ways because I don't want to get stagnant and too comfortable in how I'm showing up. And that's where you can push yourself to be an accomplice when applicable. Now, being an accomplice does have kind of a bad rap because by definition, it literally means supporting another in wrongdoing, but it is true throughout history and around today that sometimes being an accomplice to somebody does mean going against certain policies and sometimes even laws. But looking at like the most popular historical versions of this, the Underground Railroad was, yes, pioneered by Black people who were enslaved, but it was also helped and aided by accomplices who were going against the law because they believed the law to be wrong and unjust. And the same thing applies to people who were helping Jewish folks hide in their attics during the Holocaust. Being accomplice does sometimes look like going against the law because the laws are wrong. Prioritizing human need and your allyship above what is considered to be right by the state or whatever policies are in place. And that is obviously why being an accomplice shows the most risk. Now, those are obviously extreme cases. You don't have to necessarily be operating an underground railroad to be an accomplice these days. At the core of my work is helping people not feel like they are too stagnant in their allyship, making sure they understand that this work is a constant thing that we have to show up for. These aren't identities that you hold. These I think of as like verbs. They're actions that we have to choose to take every day. And no, there's not a test that's going to come up where you have to prove yourself on one of these tiers or anything like that, but it's a barometer for you to hold yourself accountable to making sure that you're doing the most that you can. I know that a lot of people hear about all of the awful things happening in the world, and they try to figure out what they can do to be involved. And sometimes nothing feels like it's actually enough or worth their time, or they've got their own problems and they're trying to survive under capitalism, and it seems impossible to get involved in every issue we care about. Which is why I teach people how to go from an ally to accomplice, making sure this work is sustainable and also making sure that you know you can take breaks. You know it can be adjustable to your capacity and what your life looks like. Perfectionism is not the goal here. Perfectionism is not actually even an option here, but that's a whole other conversation. The goal here is effort. The goal here is making sure that what we care about shows up in our actions. If you want to learn more about this framework, I have a whole course available where you can learn how to go from an ally to an accomplice for trans and non-binary people. Or if you have any questions about what this work looks like, I do want to make more content around these ideas and around the advocacy work that I do, so I'm always open to answering any questions you have. So let me know what you think, and as always, stick around as we make up for lost time.